Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Scale Smart, Grow Fast podcast. Leaders often get stuck in a reactive pattern that drain their teams and themselves. Dr. Andre Walton is going to be sharing a game-changing framework for how leaders can shift from burnout to brilliance using spherical thinking, a proven neural strategy for innovation and resilience. Drawing from his multicultural leadership experience and work with top organizations like Virgin Group and the Smithsonian, Dr. Walton's going to unpack how creativity is not a luxury, but a leadership imperative. Dr. Walton, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and nice to see you again.
Well, could you maybe share a little bit more about your background and what brought you to doing what you're doing today?
I've always had a very close link to creativity. Both my parents were artists of very high quality. My dad was actually a world-renowned artist. I did a lot of sciences and math and all that kind of stuff at high school, and promptly left school to get a job as a graphic artist for a publishing company. So, somehow or other, I've always been attracted to things related to creativity. In my I started inventing and patenting things, and the next 15 years I took two of those things to become world leaders in their field. So, one strand of my DNA is creativity, another one is a business, and the third one really is education and coaching. And so after my entrepreneurial at the time of life, I decided to go back to school and get my PhD as a mature student, although my friends wouldn't necessarily agree with that description. And my focus was organizational level creativity. And since that time, I've been helping organizations. You mentioned a couple of them, Virgin Group and Smithsonian, NASA, Lloyds Bank, and a few others, to become more innovative, generate spaces that are more conducive to being innovative. And more recently, I've been working on this concept of there being two different ways of thinking. This was kind of a theory in the back of my mind 20 years ago. And more recently, with functional MRI technology being available, and if anyone's not familiar with that, we all know what the MRI is. You fall down, smack your head, and somebody gives you an MRI to see you haven't done any damage. Well, functional MRI is just a very exciting thing for people like me, because you can actually look at neural pathways lighting up as you get people to think different things. And so those kind of, bath time theories that I came up with back in the early 2000s suddenly came to life. People have discovered that, yes, it is physically different neural pathways when you're thinking creatively than when you're thinking analytically. That led me to the idea that we have these two neural pathways. And when I studied that a little bit further, I realized that in contemporary world that we live in, surrounded by just enormous levels of complexity compared to what our brains are really used to from the perspective of evolution, we have tended to be socialized into thinking in a very deductive and analytical way. So there is this imbalance. The side of our brain that relates to creative thinking tends to have been suppressed. So if you look at the way that our world has evolved now, it's a lot more technological than it is artistic. And that imbalance, I believe, has negative consequences. And I believe that one side of those negative consequences shows up in terms of the rapid increase in burnout, anxiety, and stress disorders. And that's really, the graph in terms of the prevalence of these things has gone up and up and up over the past few years. And so that's something that influenced the direction that my business consulting has gone, because I think it's a very important issue. One of the things that I just want to throw in there before I hand it back to you is that an important factor about creative thinking is that it is inherently divergent. And in fact, divergent thinking tests are used by social psychologists like myself to measure creativity as a proxy for that. By divergent, I mean, if somebody teleported you into a totally different and weird country, like England, or somewhere, very unfamiliar, your process, your attitude of mind would have to be very open. You'd be seeing, strange things. When I first went to India, I was sitting in a little three-wheeler taxi and we were driving sort of in and out between this string of huge elephants. I mean, it was the sort of thing, if you dreamt it, you'd think, wow, that's a weird dream. And here it was in real life. So, you have to sort of have a very open mind. And you think, wow, that's a strange way of doing it, but it seems to work. When you get to the analytical process, that's really very opposite. I mean, people use phrases like drill down on something. And so what you're really doing is deductive analytical processes tend to encourage you to crank up the microscope, to focus and focus and focus. And that leads to, when people are under stress, to what I call the hamster wheel effect. It's like a racehorse that has blinders on. You're seeing the world through an ever decreasing size of window. The brilliance of kind of using creative thinking with people with burnout is that you help them to get rid of those blinders, and you help them to be able to see options. As people with very severe burnout, or even just stress or anxiety, is that they really don't see the options in a real perspective. They crank down on, their brain is so focused on their stress and their anxiety that the options they have in life just sort of get lost in that process.
There's a lot to unpack there. I've got a lot of questions here. I'm going to try to kind of combine a couple, I think, that are related and something we talked about before we started recording. And you mentioned how there's been these studies recently that came out that showed like the people who are using AI tools a lot have some decreased creativity in their thoughts. And what you mentioned too about this kind of notion that when we're trying to solve problems, oftentimes we're trained to, as you said, drill down and get really analytical, and we get these like blinders on. I've seen that when trying to use AI to help with challenges. Sometimes, like, I feel like the AI gets these blinders too, and I wonder if that is somehow related, that the way we're thinking is getting translated to that. And maybe you could address this notion of the connection between creativity and use of AI in these
Yeah,
modern times.
absolutely. There was a very interesting piece of research that was uncovered a few weeks ago. It was actually reported on in the Harvard Business Review. And it basically found that when they the researchers compared two groups, a group of executives who used AI on a regular basis and a group that did not. And they found that the group that used AI tended to have poorer results when it came to measuring their critical thinking. And so that kind of got me thinking, why would this be? And I think it's a little bit related to the human brain is intrinsically always looking for ways in which it can be lazy, increase efficiency. We see this in all sorts of areas of psychology. And so if you're sitting there having employed, the most brilliant person in the world you could imagine, who has infinite knowledge and can really answer any questions you want to throw at them, you have two very real choices. You can either say, well, I can just sit back and play a bit more golf. This guy's going to do all the work. Or you can actually say, gosh, I've got somebody here I can really learn from. And I think the natural inclination is to say, this phenomenal tool that I now have called AI can actually be doing a lot of work for me. And to some extent, that is going to alleviate some of your own requirement to think creatively as well as anything else. I mean, you'll see this just in a very casual use. If sometimes if I'm talking to, say, a career client who wants to generate another, resume. And it's easy to sort of say, okay, well, this is the framework. I want you to fill it out. And they have to sit and actively think about what are the important things in their life. The option is to throw all that data at, ChatGPT, and it'll spit out this document. And they think, gosh, that looks amazing. I could never have done that. And that's the end of it. They don't think about it anymore. So the actual cognitive work involved for them in doing that has been dramatically reduced. Well, to some extent, things like critical thinking, which is really a cousin to creative thinking, I'm going to use them in the same kind of context, is a muscle. I mean, if you don't use it, that side of your brain, that neural pathway will simply vanish. And that's, that can be seen in a number of different ways. So that's one of the things where I think creative thinking is going to really be the differentiator between people that actually use AI in such a way as their own cognitive capacity is increased versus those for whom the cognitive capacity that they have will decrease as they use AI. So that's really where I think that fits in.
Can you share maybe some examples of using AI to help increase cognitive ability and creativity? I think we talked about, the example of just like spitting out a resume that, kind of shutting off the brain creativity from that. But what are some ways leaders can encourage their teams and themselves to leverage AI in a way that increases their creativity and their analytical thinking?
That's a great question. All this is really, this thought process is really only weeks old. And so I haven't really had a lot of chance to develop that kind of process. But I think if, for instance, you put a prompt into ChatGPT that asked it to solve a particular problem that you've got versus a prompt which asked it to generate ideas that would be related to solving this problem, you'd get two totally different results. One would be the answer to your question in the eyes of GPT, which may or may not be the optimum solution. But the second is that it's then going to supply you with a number of different ways that you can then build on. Now, eventually, you might say, okay, we've got all these answers. This is my reaction to them. I want you to come up with, a nicely worded solution to the problem. But the point is that you have participated in the cognitive route to getting to that end result. And I think there are two sort of fundamentally different ways. It's a little bit like saying to a group of people, I just want you to come up to an answer to this challenge, versus I want you to join me in creating a brainstorming group. And the brainstorming group, we come up with all these ideas, we work through them. Everybody in the group is saying, well, this will work, this won't work. We haven't got the resources for this. We don't have but we do have the resources for this one. In other words, there is an interaction which makes the maximum use of both your and everybody else's knowledge, experience, and cognitive processes. And so I think there's a real parallel there in terms of using ChatGPT or anything else, AI anyway, in this process.
I think you nailed it there. One thing that we've implemented with all of our executive assistants in this year is training them to use AI as a thought partner. So before they go and just say, hey, make this prompt, rewrite this email, we have them have the AI take on a specific persona to optimize its support for them, and then have that kind of brainstorming session where we specifically train them to say, hey, I need you to interview me to get complete context and to help me brainstorm solutions for this problem rather than just giving me the answer to the problem. And the results that we've seen and the output from our employees in support of their clients has just been dramatically increased in the quality of the results we've been receiving and able to leverage AI that way. So appreciate you sharing that and kind of validating this change that
I
we've
think
been
that's
doing.
a very, very enlightened approach, Harley, and I'm glad that it's produced great results for you. And I think it's a very important issue because we all know that AI can hallucinate or simply get things wrong. And so if people get, it's a fear I have about autonomous cars. Maybe everybody gets so used to using autonomous cars that they go and rent a car with, that is not autonomous, and suddenly they realize they're driving on the wrong side of the road, which of course will come as would not be a problem for you being in England there. But, normally that's not a very good idea. And so basically, I think it's a similar kind of thing. If people start relying on something which has got inherent unreliabilities that are not necessarily obvious, and your process gets around that.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation or prediction. I've experienced it myself. Just recently, we've been having a rental car that's got a drive assist functionality that can kind of keep up with the cars in front of it or slow down when they slow down. And I've actually found myself sometimes where I forget that it's not on. And then I'm like, the car's going to brake for me when we get close enough to that car because that's what it always does. And then it's like, no, I don't have that. It's not been enabled for whatever reason. And I have this having to slam the brake on at the last minute. So it is something where you can totally become over-reliant on it and create situations that have less than optimal results or unsafe results. So definitely something for everyone who's listening to kind of be aware of as they're starting to adopt AI in their businesses, and be aware of the potential consequences of, that lessened creativity. Every day, your top performers are buried under emails, scheduling, and reporting, work that doesn't move the needle. The result? Frustration, burnout, and worst of all, lost revenue. That's why we created the Executive's Guide to Scaling High Performers, a simple, battle-tested framework to eliminate busy work and unlock your team's full potential. Inside, you'll get the exact steps top executives use to retain A players, boost productivity, and free up their team for high-impact work. Stop losing revenue. Go to workergenics.com/growthhub or check the episode notes to download the Executive's Guide to Scaling High Performers now. I want to shift a little bit to talking about the burnout. And you've spent years studying burnout. How would you define burnout, and what are some of the misconceptions that leaders often have about what burnout really is?
Well, in part because the medical profession doesn't really recognize burnout as a distinct modality. It's subsumed under the heading work-related stress. In part because of that, we tend to blame the circumstances that somebody is in for their burnout. And I certainly agree that this is a stress-related issue. There's no question about that. But it depends how you define stress. In other words, it tends to be defined as some external force which is crushing your ability to do something. And to some extent, that's true. But more predictably, this is how I define stress. I define it as if a person with burnout could have been under the same stress a year ago as they are now. And I often ask my clients, why are you with me now? What has happened that's caused you to be with me now rather than 6 months ago? And when you kind of look at that in greater detail, it's quite often the case that somebody was under the same kind of external stress 6 months ago or a year ago than they are now. But for various reasons, the symptoms of burnout really only affected them now rather than then. So it's the inability to have the resources to deal with a particular challenge at a particular time. So in other words, you're sharing the responsibility for the burnout from the external to the internal. The two of them share that responsibility. So, and that's very important because a lot of people have the notion that, I feel like I've got burnout, but all I really need is a vacation. And then they come back from the vacation and yes, they feel a little bit more relaxed and so forth. And bam, they straighten back into burnout as soon as they get back into the job or anything else. So, and because we don't have a medical system that recognizes burnout, in general, people do not treat burnout by looking at the resources and the circumstances that the person has. I mean, even the medical concept that it is work-related stress is really, even that is misguided because, stresses don't sort of switch on and off depending on where you are. They hang around. So, somebody can have moderate amount of stress at work, and then suddenly something goes on in their home life that takes them into burnout. So, it's really important to recognize that the situation is important in terms of burnout. And quite often that relates to whether somebody actually has options. If they feel they're sort of stuck in a job, they can't go up anymore for any reason, they've reached the end of their challenge, there's no challenge in this work anymore, or the challenges are too great either way. In other words, they don't have any options. And then maybe in their home life, they feel that they don't have any options either. So, there are different ways of looking at this, but the important thing is to address both of those. I actually, with my burnout clients, within the first session, we establish the 3 R's. I look at recreation, look at responsibilities, and I look at relationships. And those are 3 areas that are really crucial to look at when you're treating burnout, and they affect you both in your home life and also in your work.
One topic you speak to a lot is this concept of spherical thinking. Can you maybe share what exactly spherical thinking is, and how does that contrast with other more like reactive or linear types of thinking?
Yeah, spherical thinking really is to do with having a balance between these two thinking styles and also being able to switch between these. So, for instance, if you think of a jazz musician, they spend some time there either with dots on a page or anyway playing music that is coordinated with their fellow musicians. And Everybody knows what they're going to play. That's it. And then it comes to the appropriate point to do so, and suddenly, it's time to have an improvisation, and you've then got, however many bars of improv. And so at that point, you're switching from this structured way of playing that still has your own characteristics, but it's got structure associated with it, to a different process, which is very creative. So being able to hop between these two ways of thinking is incredibly valuable. And not just as a jazz musician, but anyway, just in the general course of life. You can see people that do this from time to time. I mean, if you have a look at sort of Steve Jobs, when he was, from what we know from writing and anecdotally, he really had this kind of ability. So when appropriate, using analysis and deduction is crucial to running a business. But also, it's so important to be able to say, this particular challenge requires me to think creatively. We need a creative solution to this particular challenge. And so being able to switch between those two is really what spherical thinking is all about.
Now, does spherical thinking, connect with helping people develop their creative thinking more? And how would this possibly relate to increasing resilience in the workplace? We talked about burnout and the link between being able to have that creativity thinking. What is that connection there? What does it look like? And how can leaders employ it to be more resilient in their workplace?
Spherical thinking leads to higher emotional intelligence, and this is shown through fMRI studies, again, in the sense that the neural pathways related to creativity are also the same ones that relate to emotional intelligence. So that's point number one. Point number two is that the combination of these factors of these two ways of thinking is very important. So even if you look at an artist, for instance, a painter, let's say, the creative aspect is going to be crucial when the brush meets the canvas. But they also need deductive thinking ahead of time. So they need to make sure when my sister goes to paint, she needs to make sure she's got the right brushes, the right paint. We all need structure in whatever we do, whether we're being creative or not. So the balance between the structure and the ability to think with divergence, to be able to look at the whole picture, is where the value comes in. And at least, even if things don't end up going in the right direction, these two will give you the maximum possibility of getting things right. And there's endless examples I can cite of times when that has happened and times when that hasn't happened. But basically, and that's the basis of resilience, because resilience fails primarily when you feel you have not had the resources to meet a challenge. And sometimes that means, quite simply, that you don't feel you've done your best, that you could have done better. If all the boxes are checked regarding I did everything I could, this was beyond my control, then resilience really isn't going to be challenged. So the combination of these two sets of thinking, in a sense, covers all bases. You've got the structure necessary to put things in place. You've got, if you're meeting a business challenge, that structure may include having the right resources in terms of human resources, everybody being competent and being appropriate for the task they have to do. And then you've also got the creative thinking in the sense that the plan has the direction related to a novel way of approaching it, or at least a way of approaching the problem that covers all the potential areas of failure.
Can you share with the audience maybe simple, practical changes in their mindset that can maybe help them rewire their brain to increase their creativity and innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. The first and easiest process is simply what I call shaking the snow globe, just really disrupting those knee-jerk reactions that we make during the day. So this can be as simple as having a cup of ginger tea in the morning rather than heading for the cake cup. When you go to your favorite restaurant, maybe choose a different item from the menu, or even choose a different restaurant, choose different recreation. But if you're planning a vacation with the family, get everybody around and create a dream board, otherwise known as a vision board, where the family everybody's getting maybe photographs or pictures, printing things off the internet, about this place you're going to go. You mentioned you'll be going to Cascais in Portugal. So, getting photographs of those places, perhaps even including the photograph of the hotel you plan to stay in and some of the places and all this kind of thing helps you live the future. And that has two consequences. One is it's a creative process. We're not sort of saying, well, I need to look at, the price of the airline ticket. I need to look at the price of the train ticket if I go from Cascais down to the Algarve or, whatever. I mean, all those logical kind of things. It's about doing something very differently. You're actually using your creative side of your mind to get things together. But it also, because you're able to live that future, it also gives you the possibility of seeing the flaws in it, seeing where the problem will be. The world is replete with places like sort of Florida, to some extent, the Algarve, also where people retire. And a good proportion of them, after the first year, will be looking to see if they can move back again because they haven't anticipated leaving their friends behind, the fact that they don't actually like hot weather as much as they thought they did, and various other things. So, being able to really be in the future is something that this process can kind of help.
Awesome. That's so valuable. Well, Dr. Walton, you've shared some incredible insights and strategies with our audience today. If people want to learn more about you or continue the conversation, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
My email is dr.andre.
And you have a book that you published recently. And you want to share about that briefly here at
Yes,
the end?
absolutely. It's Creative Thinking, a Coach's Perspective. And I'm pleased to say that rocketed its way up to being an international bestseller within the first few weeks. And that really takes us back in history to the very beginning of the kind of known history of the human race, right up to where we are now. That's really the first chapter and shows us that creativity has always been with us. And also within that context, I also look at our own personal evolution from the time we're born to the time we are now. And the book also discusses the fact that creative thinking was the way we thought after we were born. We had no history. We're looking at a blank sheet of paper there in terms of experience. And so the only option was for us to think creatively and you can see this in children. If you're looking at young children, they will find things, that this is no longer a computer mouse. This is a cell phone. There's all sorts of ways that kids can think very creatively. So that's why, in my work as a coach, it's really very easy for me to get people to think creatively because we have those roots. We have done that. So it's really the book is in it through its 9 chapters. It expands on all those concepts as well as touching on burnout, as well as looking at ways to help ourselves develop these processes.
Was there something you wanted to share from the book with the audience, like a link or something?
Yes, it's on Amazon and it comes up if you type in my name, Andre Walton, and Creative Thinking, a Coach's Perspective.
Awesome. We'll make sure to get that linked in the show notes. And if you got value from this episode, do one quick thing. Hit that like, follow, subscribe button on whatever platform you're viewing this on. It helps us reach more leaders just like you. Maybe you know a business owner or other business leader who could use this information. Share this episode with them. It could be exactly what they need right now. And again, thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll see you all on the next one.